Welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur, Parsha's Toldos. I'd like to share with you a fabulous idea that I heard originally from Rabbi Hartman, and then two shorter ideas at the end. So the opening idea, if you look at the box, and if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Yitzchak Avinu perhaps is the central character of this week's Parsha. Parsha's Toldos is the Parsha of Yitzchak Avinu. And if you think about it, he has two restrictions. Two things he's told not to do. Or at least one time he's told it and one time he sort of figures it out himself, his own intuition. Number one is not to leave Eretz Yisrael. And number two is not to marry a shifcha. Let's take a look at the psukim to explore this in more detail. So the first box, Vahirav ba'aretz, this is the beginning of the parsha. There is a famine in the land. Milvad harav harishon asher hoy b'mei Avraham. Aside from the famine that took place in the times of Avraham, vayelech Yitzchak el Avimelech melech Pelishtim gerara. So Yitzchak heads south. He doesn't leave Eretz Yisrael yet. He goes to Pelishtim, which is pretty much where the Gaza Strip is today, on the coast there, where the Pelishtim lived, to a place called Gerar. Vayera Elav Hashem, and he has a dream. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to him in a nevuah. Vayomer al tered Mitzrayim, do not go down to Mitzrayim. Shechein ba'aretz asher omer lecha. You stay in the land which I promised you, which I said to you. Gur ba'aretz hazo, stay, dwell in this land. Ve'eyeh emoch, and I will be with you. Va'avorchecha, and I will bless you. Ki lecha u'lezaracha etel es kol ha'aretz Yisrael. Because for you and your children I will give these lands. Va'kimoisi and I will fulfill thereby the promise that I made to Avram your father. And I will increase your seed like the stars of the heaven. And I will give your children, your descendants, all of these lands. And through your seed, your children, all of the nations of the world will flourish and will be blessed. Because Avram Avinu listened to my voice, and he listened to everything I said. Fine, beautiful, very, very beautiful psukim. Says Rashi on the pasuk Al Terid Mitzrayim, because that was his intention. He was heading south. He was going down to Gerar, to Pelishtim, which is the south. West of Eretz Yisrael, and he was going down with the intention to go further down to Mitzrayim, like his father Avram did in the time of famine. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, Al terid Mitzrayim she'ata oila t'mima. Do not go down to Mitzrayim. Why not? Because you are an oila t'mima, ve'ein chutz la'aretz kedai lecha. Because you were offered up on the Akedah almost, and therefore you have the status of an oila, of a perfect carbon, and therefore chutz la'aretz is not for you. Okay, so Yitzchak, is told not to leave Eretz Yisrael. Now, point number two. Earlier in the Psukim it said, in Perek Chafei, Vayimlu Yomer Loledes, the very beginning of the Parsha, that Rivka waits 20 years to have a child, she becomes pregnant, V'hinei Soime Bebidno, and she's carrying twins. And then they're born, Vayetze Orishna Admoini, the first one comes out, red, Kulei ka'aderes, like a red coat, a red mantle. Vayikru shmoi Esov, and he's called Esov. Va'achrichein yotza achiv, and then his brother comes out. V'yodei achezes ba'akev Esov, and he's holding on to the heel of Esov. Vayikru shmoi Yaakov, and they call the second child Yaakov. V'yitzchak ben shishim shona beledes Esom, and Yitzchak at that time is 60 years old. He gets married at 40. He waits 20 years until he becomes a father. On that pasuk, Ben Shishim Beledes Esom, says Rashi, how do you get to 60? He waited 10 years until Rivka, who was 3 when she became a wife, when she got married, until she was 13 years old, and was able to bear children. And then he waited a further 10 years trying to have children, like his father did to Sarah. And then, after this 10-year period, a total of 20 years since he got married, he realized that she was barren, and therefore he davened for her. Now, continues Rashi, importantly, so he didn't want to marry a shifcha, a maidservant, like Avram did, like Yaakov did. Well, he didn't want to marry a second wife. Because he became sanctified in Har Moriah, to become an Oila Tamima. Fine. So you have two restrictions on Yitzchak. The first one is not to leave Eretz Yisrael, where he was instructed to stay in Eretz Yisrael. And the second one, he figured out himself, he intuited not to marry a Shifcha because he was Niskadish Bahar Maria, as Rashi said. Now, asks Meshulam David Soloveitchik. Meshulam David Soloveitchik was the youngest son of the Briskerov, passed away only recently, a year or two ago, and he married the sister of Rebbetzin Ehrentreu. He married Sternbach, so he's well known in London quarters, and he was one of the great Rosh Hashivas of our time. The Rosh Hashiva of Shraga Feivel Zimmerman, here of London fame as well. He's also got some very interesting stories about him. But anyway, he asked the following question. Listen to this question. Why was he told the first restriction? Why was Yitzchak told b'peh moles, directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not to leave Eretz Yisrael, but the second one, i.e. not to marry a Shifcha, he had to work out himself? Why was it that way around? And in fact, logically, you could argue it could be the opposite. You see, a carbon oila has rules. For example, a carbon oila is Kodshe Kodshim, which is the highest level of sanctity, the highest level of Kedusha. And Kodshe Kodshim may not leave the Azara after the Shechita. That's the law, that's the halacha. So it makes sense that he can't leave Eretz Yisrael. But marrying a Shifcha has nothing to do with the carbon. So if anything, I would have thought that maybe that he needs to be told categorically by Kodesh Baruch Hu not to marry a Shifcha and not to leave Eretz Yisrael. He'll figure out himself. So ask from Meshulam David Soloveitchik, why is it this way around? Why was he told not to leave Eretz Yisrael directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And why is it not to marry a Shifcha? He had to figure it out. Okay. So let's take a look at the Maharal. There's a beautiful Maharal. Again, I give credit to Rabbi Hartman, who shared this, I think last year or the year before. He said the following. There's a Maharal in Gvuras Hashem in Perek Yutes, and I'm reading, again, key parts from it. Says the Maharal, bottom box of the sheet. Ach, Shadayin Kosher, Loma lo nosa Moshe bas Yisrael, min ha-miyuchasim k'may Aaron. He says a very interesting question. Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipora, who was a Gioris. Why didn't he marry someone who was miyuchas who was, had Jewish parents, like Aaron, his brother, did? Don't think for a moment, says the Maharal, that's just how it happened to be. He just married Tzipora, it's by chance. He says that's the way foolish people look at these things. These are essential matters. Don't think that you take something which is so important, so essential, and you make it like just by chance. That's how it happened. Don't think like that. And therefore, you really need to figure out why was this? Why did he marry a Gioris? To someone who came from Jewish parents. He says something very, very strong. He says, and for that reason, because he didn't marry someone who was Zera Kodesh, i.e. of Jewish descent, therefore his own children weren't of the same caliber as the children of Aaron HaKohen. And because of that, the Gemara in Bava Basra, Daf Kuftes Bey says, it's very important, if you can, to marry someone who's of good yichus, of good genealogical stock. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu lechatchila want to marry someone from an Ummah Acheres, even though he sort of puts into jeopardy the possibility of marrying someone who's miyuchas like Aaron did, and therefore perhaps his children might not would struggle perhaps to reach the heights that the children of Aaron HaKohen reached. Of course, to caveat it, the question is how that applies nowadays, and of course, Bnei Gerim and Gerim themselves can be outstanding personalities. Again, it's not for now, but Shmaya, Avtalin, and so many others, Rikiva, some of the greats in Jewish history. But when it came to Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Maharal, his children were not on the Madrega of Aaron because they were not from Jewish. His wife was not from Jewish parents. It's a very strong question. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu choose to marry a Gioris? And Teda. And when you explore this and you think about it, Teda, it wasn't by chance. There's something wondrous going on. What is that? It is well known that Moshe Rabbeinu was on the level of the whole of the Jewish people, i.e., he somehow equated the entire Klal Yisrael. He had the status, as it were, of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, for example, the Pasuk says in the beginning of Parsha Yisro, "Vayishma Yisro kohen midjan chosin Moshe es kol asher osa lekim leMoshe u'Yisrael." What does Chazal say? Shokol Moshe keneged kol Yisrael. He was equal to the rest of the Jewish people. And that's what the Mechilta says in Parsha B'Shalach, Isha achas hoysem Mitzrayim, v'yoldosh ishim riba b'keres echad. The Medrash says that there was a woman in Mitzrayim who gave birth to 600,000 people. And everyone laughed. What do you mean? How's that? That's ridiculous. How can one woman give birth to 600,000 people? No, it's true. That's referring to Yocheved Sheyolda es Moshe, who gave birth to Moshe. That the Torah, the Pasuk, equates Moshe Rabbeinu to 600,000 people, and that's what the Medrash means. When you appreciate the madrega, the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, you'll understand that's exactly what it means. And therefore, it's important for every husband to be on the same plane, on the same level as their wife. They should be in the same plane, the same level. You take one Jewish person, they're 1 out of 600,000. How can that equate to 600,000? It doesn't work. But a ger who is considered chutz Yisrael is not part of Klal Yisrael, not 1 in 600,000. Ve'enom bichlal shishim ribu Yisrael yosim izdaveg leMoshe ba'avur hashivu hazeh. And therefore, you can equate a giores with Moshe Rabbeinu, who has got the status of the entire Klal Yisrael, because they're considered one entity. They're not one part of 600,000. So for him to be mashadach, for him to marry someone who is merely 1/600th of an entity, it's not going to work. They're on a different playing field. They're on a different level. So therefore, he felt that he had to marry a Gioris who is a whole entity, just like he is a whole entity. Ki Moshe nivdal mi-Yisrael, because Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Maharal, at the bottom line, is separate from Klal Yisrael in as much as he's not just part of Klal Yisrael, he is Klal Yisrael. He's not just 1 in 600,000, he is 600,000. V'chein ha-Gioris gam kein, and so too, a Gioris as well, Eino nichneses tachas mispar Yisrael. She's not just 1 in 600,000, she's an own entity. V'kasher nefesh ha-Gioris zocha, and if the Gioris is worthy, and of course Tzipporah was, then she has the same status as Klal Yisrael. And understand this, kiheim nifloim, because they are wondrous. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu married her, me'uma acheres, a woman from a different country, afal pisha Yisrael heim ikka ha'olam, even though Klal Yisrael is ikka, yesh b'umas ha'olam tosefes al Yisrael. In this respect, Klal Yisrael there's some sort of advantage over Klal Yisrael. And for that reason, says the Maharal, that Moshe Rabbeinu married the Gioris because they have that advantage over Klal Yisrael. Okay, very interesting Maharal. So how does that fit into all of this? As follows. Yitzchak didn't see himself as a carbon. He recognized that he had the Kedusha, but was only nearly a carbon. That's what he thought. He didn't see himself as a carbon oila. He recognized he was a very, Baruch Hashem, he had achieved tremendous madregas and he had tremendous Kedusha, but he was only nearly a carbon. And therefore, he realized that it would not be appropriate to marry a shifcha, because you've got to marry someone, like the Maharal explains, on the same level as you. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipporah, because he cannot marry just a stam lady in Klal Yisrael. But he didn't think it was a problem to leave Eretz Yisrael, since he didn't have the actual status of a carbon. That's what he thought. So it turns out that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to tell him, no, you have the status of a carbon oila. You are a carbon oila, and therefore you don't think you do. I'm telling you do. And therefore, you cannot leave Eretz Yisrael. Because just like a carbon ola is restricted into where it can go, you too have got the status of a carbon ola. You too are restricted in where you can go. But he didn't fit, but he didn't. He realized that he was on a very lofty level, so he understood himself that it would not be appropriate to marry a shifcha because, like the Maharal explains with Moshe Rabbeinu, it's imperative that a man marries someone who is an ezer kenegdo, which understands the Maharal is ben giloi, someone who is at the same status, the same level, the same madrega as them, and therefore Yitzchak intuited the fact that he couldn't marry a shifcha, but he had to be told that he cannot leave Eretz Yisrael because he does have the status of a carbon. Now, if you look back at the words of Rashi, this is always the good test. You'll see the clue is in the very exact wording of Rashi. Take a look. This is magnificent. Says Rashi, "V'shifcha lo rotza lisa, lefi sheniskadesh bahar hamaria liyos oila tmima." That's the nusach of Rashi over there. He didn't want to marry Shifcha. Why? Lefi sheniskadesh bahar hamaria. He had become very elevated in hamaria. He understood that. To be like an Ola Tamima, because that's what Yitzchak's thinking was. But when it comes to the next Rashi, i.e. telling him not to leave Eretz Yisrael, look what Rashi says. Amalei al terid mitzrayma she'ata Ola Tamima. You are an Ola Tamima. Ve'ein chutz la'aretz kedai. It says it befurish. It says it categorically. You are an Ola Tamima, therefore you cannot leave. But when it comes to not marrying a Shifcha, it says Lefisha niskadesh bahar Maria lios Ola Tamima. You've got the kedusha of it. That's what he understood. So in other words, in answer to our question, why is it, says Rameshum David Soloveitchik, that he had to be told categorically not to leave Eretz Yisrael, but he only had to figure out not to marry Shifcha by himself? The answer is because Yitzchak didn't see himself as a carbon. He didn't see himself properly as a carbon oila. I understood that I've achieved tremendous heights and I've got kedusha. I'm niskadsha bahar Maria, and therefore I've got this. I'm like an oila tamima, and therefore it's not appropriate for me to marry a shifcha because, like the Maharal explains, I've got to marry someone on my own level. To the extent that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't marry a regular Bas Yisrael, he had to marry someone who was also a whole entity and not just part of a bigger picture. But when it came to leaving Eretz Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch had to tell him, no, you're not just like a carbon oila, you have the status of a carbon oila, and just like a carbon oila is restricted in where it can go, you are restricted in where you can go, and you cannot leave Eretz Yisrael. And that's why Rashi says it in a very direct way, Al terid mitzrayma she'ata oila tamima. Very interesting, very fascinating idea. Again, credit to Rabbi Hartman for answering that question of Meshulem David Soloveitchik. Okay, let's finish off with two shortish ideas. I'm a big fan of the Sefer Beis Av. Beis Av is a beautiful Sefer, Rabbi Yoachim Schlesinger. He should live and be well. Kamanahar is 102, 103 years old, living here in London. He's got a fabulous Sefer on Chumash called Beis Av. My friend quotes it a lot. And I never managed to get hold of this Sefer, but his son, Shai Schlesinger, is a Rav here, and very charismatic and very big Talmud Chacham. And I see him lots. I learn in the same base medrash in the evening, and I asked him if he can get hold of his father's Sefer, and he very kindly got hold of it for me. So hopefully we'll be seeing more of the Beis Av in the coming weeks and months ahead. But I just thought I've just got the Sefer, so I'd dip into it this week. So just two short ha'aras from Rabbi Yoachim Schlesinger, but both are very, very, very special. Let's take a look. Paragraph 2 on the sheet. Let me again read you some background psukim. V'rivka shemas bedaber Yitzchak el Esav b'noi v'yelech Esav asad lotzut l'tzayid lahavi. Again, perhaps the center point of this week's Sedra is, of course, the brachas that Yitzchak is going to give, and Esav is confident that he's going to get them. And as he goes out to hunt, Rivka overhears the instructions that he gives. Rivka overhears the instructions that Yitzchak gives to Esav. For Rivka Omer el Yaakov, and Rivka quickly gets into action, and she says to Yaakov, "B'no lemer, hine shamaitis avicha medaber el Esav achicha lemer, havir litzayed usani matamim va'oichel v'archecha lifnei Hashem lifnei Mosi, and quickly prepare for me food for lifnei Mosi va'ato b'ni shma b'koli la'asher ani metzavo yisach." So Rivka gets, she says, now listen very carefully, because we've got to intervene quickly, because the future of the world depends on this. Leich no el hatzoin v'kachli misham shnei gedi izim. Go get 2 goats. Tovim ve'eser som matamim lavicha kasher ohev. And then we'll prepare delicious food for your father the way he likes it. Okay, the famous incident that Esau is out hunting to prepare the matamim to give to Yitzchak. Rivka overhears and she says, go get shnei gediyah izim. Why shnei gediyah izim? Why 2 goats? Says Rashi, v'chi shnei gediyah izim hoya machol shel Yitzchak. Is that what he's going to eat? 2 goats? That's a lot of meat. No, one is going to be the korban pesach, and one is going to be the matamim, the meal that you're going to make for him. Fine, that's the famous Rashi. Take a look at the base of. This is the 3rd box in paragraph 2. Pirush Rashi korban pesach. Lama dafka korban pesach. Why is it that Yitzchak dafka chose Esau to go out and get his korban pesach? Efsha, perhaps the answer is this. Because in other words, there are other korbanos. If it was Seder night and it was Pesach, you can bring other korbanos. You can bring the Shamei Chagiga, the Oilas Ru'iyah. It doesn't have to be the korban Pesach. Why Dafka is the focus on the fact that Yitzchak told Esau to get the korban Pesach? Efshe Mishum, Sheskulas korban Pesach Hoya. There's something special about the korban Pesach. She'al Yodai Zochu Yisrael, that through it Klal Yisrael merit, Afa Pi Shelo Hayru'uyim, even though they're not worthy. That is what Pesach is all about. It's this burst of a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that even though we're not ready, like the Pasuk says in Yecheskel, Va'at Eiroim Ve'eria, that Klal Yisrael were described as naked. V'darshu Chazal Medrash Rabbi, and the Medrash famously says, Shehoyu Arumim min HaMitzvahs, the Klal Yisrael at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim were empty of mitzvahs. V'lo hayo lehem zuchus, and they didn't have any merit. V'nitzin lohem mitzvahs korban Pesach, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them the mitzvah of korban Pesach, sheyizku al yodai, that they would merit it. They would have that zuchus. V'hu sheyoda Yitzchak, and that is what Yitzchak understood. Ki be'emes Esau ein lo zuchus. He understood that Esau did not have any merits. V'al kein rotzu litin lo mitzvahs korban Pesach, and therefore Yitzchak wanted to give him dafka the mitzvah of korban Pesach, sheyeh lo zuchus lebracha, because that is exactly what korban Pesach is. It's this freebie, it's this free gift which gives a person zuchus. Ve'efshu gam ha'inyan ma shekosvu b'sfarim hakadoshim. And that perhaps connects with what the Sfarim HaKadoshim say. Ki belel HaPesach mesugel kol adam lizkos lemale yosim asher. That on the night of Pesach, on Seder night, a person can be catapulted to a level which is actually beyond him. Mishum shezu mesugeles korban Pesach kamo shehoiv Mitzrayim. And that's really what Yitzchak's intention was. That he recognized that Esau was far from anything he wanted him to be. And he would dafka give him korban Pesach, because korban Pesach is mesugel to give a person zuchus that he doesn't quite merit yet, and hopefully that will catapult him to greater things. That perhaps, says Rav Schlesinger, was Yitzchak's intention, and that's why dafka korban Pesach. Okay, one further and final idea, and that is also from Rav Schlesinger's Beisav. Again, some background psukim. This is the very end of the Parsha. Vayishlach Yitzchak es Yaakov. So at the end of the Parsha, after the whole episode of the brachas, and Esau discovers that Yaakov had got in there and got the brachas, Yitzchak dispatches and sends Yaakov away. Vayelech padena Aram el Lavan ben Besuel Harami achi Rivka eim Yaakov Esau. That Yitzchak sends Lavan away to the house of Lavan, the son of Besuel. Vayar Esau ki beirach Yitzchak es Yaakov. And Esau saw that Yitzchak gave a bracha to Yaakov. V'shilach Esau padena Aram lakach ze misham isha bercha so vayitzav olav leima lo ysikach isha, and he saw all of that. Vayishma Yaakov el Aviv, and Yaakov listened to his father, ve'elimoy to his mother. Vayelech padena Aram, and they went off to Padan Aram. Vayar Esav ki rois benos Canaan be'enei Yitzchak Aviv. Esav saw that the daughters of Canaan were bad in the eyes of Yitzchak. Vayelech Esav Yishmael vayikach es machlas bas Yishmael ben Avram achas nevoyes el noshav lo leisha. And he went to Yishmael and he married his daughters, etc., etc. There ends Parshas Toldos. Says Rav Schlesinger, fascinating. If you look closely at these psukim, there's a theme that emerges. Whenever it refers to Esau, it's Vayar Esau, he sees. But when it comes to Yaakov, it's Vayishma. So Pasuk Vov says, Vayar Esau ki berech Yitzchak. Pasuk Zayin, Vayishma Yaakov. Pasuk Ches, Vayar Esau. Why is it when it comes to Esau, it's Vayar, and when it comes to Yaakov, it's Vayishma? Says the Beisav, says Rabbi Yaakov Schlesinger, Lo ne'emar she'osa Esau kain miyad. It's not that when Esau didn't act immediately. Kasher tzivo Yitzchak es Yaakov lo sikach. When Yitzchak instructed Yaakov lo sikach, don't take the pasuk says, where is it? When Yitzchak instructed Yaakov not to take the local ladies, Isham b'nei Canaan, and rather go to the house of Lavan, Esav saw that. But it's not that he heard the instruction, but only Achash vayishma Yaakov el Aviv, but only after Yaakov listened to his father and acted on it, then he went and did the same thing. In other words, what was the trigger for Esav to go to Yishmael and marry Machlas bas Yishmael? It wasn't seeing it wasn't hearing the instructions that Yitzchak had given Yaakov, but it was seeing Yaakov actually fulfill those instructions. And then you can listen to what he says. That's the way of superficial individuals. Knowing doesn't make an impact on them. So Esav knew that his father said to Yaakov, don't take the local girls. But that wasn't enough. It was only seeing Yaakov actually go off and do it, that's what made impression. When you see people fulfilling this instruction, and listening to the words of Hashem, then that's what influences them to do it. Only after Yaakov led and did it, did Esav do the same. For who Talmud, and this is instructive, for those who want to influence others, that they themselves should actually conduct themselves in this way, for who Yisoid b'chinuch na'arim gamkein, which is a fundamental point in chinuch. So the point that Beis Av is making, which Schlesinger is making, is very powerful. Esav heard his father instruct Yaakov to go and not to take the girls from Bnei Canaan, to go far away. That made no impression on him. But then Yaakov listened, and he went to Padan Aram, and only then Vayar Esav Kirat, and only then did the penny drop. Did Esav realize, I should do the same. Bnei Canaan is bad in the eyes of Yitzchak. That's a very powerful idea. People who are not necessarily of a high madrega, or they're young, or whatever it may be, telling them to do something is not going to have an impact. Doing it and them seeing it in action, that's what's going to have an impact. And therefore Esav, as he describes as someone who is Kali Hadas, knowing it wasn't enough. He heard, it says, Vayar Esav kiberach Yitzchak, and he instructed him. But that wasn't sufficient for him. It was only when Yaakov actually carried it out and he saw it, B'chush, he saw it, he had someone to see, he had a precedent to follow, then that was what impacted him, that was the trigger, and only then did he wake up, did the penny drop, Vayar Esav kiras b'nei Canaan, etc., and he acted on it. He sees it, but not that he hears it, because that doesn't give the same impression. So there we have 3 ideas from this week's Parsha. The first, the main idea, that the question of Rishon David Soloveitchik, why is it that the 2 restrictions that Yitzchak had, why is it not to leave Eretz Yisrael was said categorically to him by Hashem, but not to marry a shifcha, was only intuited by Yitzchak himself? And the answer of Rabbi Hartman, that when a man marries a woman, he has to marry someone on the same level playing field, as described by the Maharal regarding Moshe and Tzipporah. But therefore, Yitzchak felt that he wasn't quite a carbon. He was elevated. He understood that he had kedusha. He was niskadish bahar Maria, and therefore it would not be appropriate. But he didn't think he was actually like a proper oila, and therefore an oila had to be. He was like an oila. And that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to tell him. And therefore you can't leave Eretz Yisrael. You've got restrictions like any other carbon oila. And it's very meduyik in the words of Rashi as described. And then the 2 points of Schlesinger. Why carbon Pesach? Because Yitzchak's hope was that just like carbon Pesach is considered a freebie, it's a posuk of At Erem Ve'Eria, when a person is naked and empty of mitzvahs, that is a special zuchus that it sort of can leapfrog him to higher heights. That was the hope of Yitzchak for his son Esav, and that's why Dafka it's carbon Pesach. And lastly, doing and seeing. Amazingly, if you look at the psukim very clearly, it says that Esav only acted he only recognized ki ro'es benos Canaan, not when Yitzchak told Yaakov that, but when Yaakov actually left home, because there is a difference between knowing and seeing. And that, says the Beis Av, is a very powerful lesson in chinuch and in life generally.